The sun hung low over the barren horizon, casting long shadows that melted into the dusty earth of the border camp. In the midst of restless murmurs and the sharp scent of gunpowder lingering in the dry air, the notorious gunfighter, a man carved from solitude and steeled by countless battles, stepped forward with a calm that unsettled even the most hardened men around him. Without hesitation, he slipped $5 into a weathered hand. Claiming ownership of a young Apache slave, the camp fell silent, the weight of his decision rippling through the crowd like a sudden storm, leaving nothing but shocked eyes and whispered disbelief in its wake. This border camp, a motley gathering under the vast and unforgiving sky, bore the marks of the frontier's harshness. Tattered tents flapped against a relentless breeze that carried the mingled aromas of sweat, smoke, and scorched earth. Horses stamped impatiently, while wary eyes flicked between strangers and familiar faces alike. Each man and woman sized up with guarded suspicion. The gunpowder's acrid bite hung heavily, mingling with whispers that spoke of grudges and dangers lurking beyond the trembling campfire light. Amidst this simmering tension, the gunfighter's figure commanded silent reverence, part legend, part enigma. His cold efficiency was etched into every measured movement, his gaze sharp and unreadable. Whispered tales of his exploits trailed behind him like a shadow, mingling fear with cautious respect. Opposite him stood the boy, young yet defiant, his dark eyes flashing with an unnatural fire, despite the chains clinking softly at his wrists. His posture spoke volumes, restless muscles poised between submission and resistance, more warrior than captive, a flicker of unspoken strength breaking through the facade of captivity. At once, murmurs erupted from the crowd. Disbelief cracked the edges of their murmured judgments, mingling with scorn and suspicion. $5, a pittance barely worth the spark of life itself, to buy a soul marked by captivity? The act was incendiary, a coin tossed into a nest of vipers. Eyes narrowed, voices thick with contempt questioned the reasoning behind such an impulsive gamble, while some bristled at the implied challenge to their codes and bargains long carved into the desert's grit. The delicate balance in the camp threatened to shatter beneath the weight of unspoken questions and uncertain alignments. Tension thickened the air as the gunfighter met the boy's relentless stare. Words went unspoken, but roared between them, a silent exchange layered with challenge and cautious intrigue. Around them, the hum of alarmed whispers rose and fell like a restless tide, bodies stiffening, breaths held in anticipation. Something more than a simple transaction had been set in motion, a story weaving threads of danger and secret purpose beneath the surface, shadowed but potent. Then, as if anchored by the very earth beneath their feet, the young Apache fixed the gunfighter with a look that cut deeper than any bullet. It was a gaze brimming with unyielding defiance and a warning, unvoiced but understood. This purchase, for but $5, would unravel fates far beyond this campfire's fragile glow. The moment hung suspended, charged with peril and promise, inviting all who bore witness to brace for the unfolding tempest. Many fellow travelers who follow our legends across these forgotten lands have told us how fate, or the treacherous YouTube algorithm, sometimes undoes their subscriptions without warning. Before the next dangerous trail unfolds and a new twist comes, take a quick glance below the video and make sure you're still signed up with our band, not to lose the thread. We don't want you to miss a single voice echoing from this valley. Check your subscription now and join our saga. The sun had barely blushed beyond the ridges when the gunfighter's worn boots scuffed the dry earth of his cabin's threshold. Inside, shadows clung stubbornly to the corners, the sparse furnishings whispering tales of solitude. At the center, the young Apache sat with his back rigid against the rough-hewn wall, wrists scarred but still unyielding, eyes sharp enough to pierce through the silence. Their coexistence was a theater of cold glances and measured silences. Neither spoke much, not from politeness, but from a dance of wariness, each sizing the other like wary predators. The boy's defiance was a steady burn beneath flickering muscles, refusing to bow to chains, visible or invisible. For every cautious glance he threw, the gunfighter replied with a hardened gaze that mixed a tacit understanding with steely command. This cabin's walls ain't the kind to hold for men who ain't broken. The gunfighter finally muttered, one evening, voice low as creaking floorboards. But maybe, he added, eyes narrowing, sometimes even walls gotta reckon with fire. The Apache's lips tightened into a frail smirk, not submission, but challenge. His voice cut the stale air, measured and biting. Chains ain't just metal. Walls surround the mind first. Days passed under the pall of suspicion. Each moment a battleground of wills. The gunfighter watched the boy with strange interest. Not pity, nor cruelty, but something harsher. Calculation curled with an ember of empathy. To buy the boy for $5 was never mere accident. Beneath that austere act lay a strategy, and bewilderingly, a quiet human reckoning no man in the border camp could see. Then came the ripple of outside danger. News rode in harsh and unyielding, carried by grim-faced lawmen trudging through dust and whispered rumors. They came to the village, officials with mirrored badges and rigid stares, searching for the Apache boy, rumored to be a fugitive, a threat, a spark they sought to snuff out before it could blaze into rebellion. The gunfighter felt the weight settle, the line between protector and outlaw trembling thin. He stepped into the dim light of dusk, lanterns scraping his knuckles as his fingers tightened around its rusted handle. Movement beyond the cabin's cracked shutters caught his eye. Shadows threading through the scant brush like ghosts summoned by the scent of fear. Without hesitation, he pulled the boy away from the wall, the gleam of silent threat exchanged between them. "You ever seen how they hunt a ghost?" the gunfighter whispered, voice rough like dry timber. "We ain't got long. They'll tear this place apart if you're still here come morning." The Apache's gaze sharpened, no longer just fierce defiance, but a flicker of grudging trust, the unspoken birth of alliance, wrapped in survival's cold cloak. Outside, the calm was a tense pulse. The lawman's boots thudded closer, feet crunching over cracked earth that held memories of blood and flight. From the cabin's back, a narrow path curled into the thickets, a fragile thread of hope winding away from prying eyes. The gunfighter's mind raced through options tethered by necessity and calculation. To hide the boy was no longer choice, but command. The land offered secrets, caves inhaling the desert heat, whispers of old trails forgotten even by the wind. He gestured sharply. "You're moving, silent and fast. Our shield is silence and shadow." The Apache met his eyes, the fire still burning fierce, yet tempered by the rawness of immediate danger. Together, they moved, a pair bound not by freedom, but by the imperative of evasion. The boy's steps were light, but deliberate. Each breath pulled tight against the rising threat. The gunfighter lifted a spare coat over the boy's shoulders, masking more than just his figure. It was an unspoken pledge. As they threaded through the brush, the gunfighter's voice broke the oppressive quiet. "Don't think this softens what you are. It only means the world outside don't yet understand." The Apache glanced sideways, the crease of a smile, a momentary thaw. Maybe it never will. Maybe the fight is more than running. The night deepened, swallowing the trail behind them. Somewhere beyond lay an uncertain horizon, an uncertain tomorrow. But for now, beneath the indifferent stars, survival demanded shadows. Their refuge lay just beyond the next ridge, fleeting and fragile. Behind them, the footsteps of the pursuing lawmen clenched closer, a relentless echo growing louder in the encroaching night. The gunfighter's jaw clenched as the weight of the moment settled heavy. The chase had begun, and the cost of his impulsive purchase was about to test every hard-earned truth he carried. He glanced at the boy beside him, once captive and now his hidden charge. The road ahead was steep, and the darkness deeper than either had yet dared reckon. The patrol was closing in, and the gunfighter knew they must disappear quickly. The gunfighter's footsteps were muffled beneath a heavy cloak of silence. As he lingered near the dying embers of his lone fire, the night air thick with twilight's hush. Beside him, the young Apache sat unmoving, shadows sketched sharply across his stern profile, a boy chained not just in body, but drenched in memories too raw for ease. The lawman's pursuit had receded behind them, yet the true chase had only just begun. Each breath they drew was a fragile thread in a tapestry, woven with the pain of broken histories and unspoken truths. The gunfighter, once a man of cold precision, felt the shifting tides of unfamiliar tides within himself. No longer was the Apache simply his purchase, but a living history he could no longer afford to ignore. He had begun studying the quiet discipline etched into the boy's posture, the subtle ritual of his gaze, the economy of his movement, fragments of a culture vast and old, coded in silence and sharpened survival. Words between them remained sparse, but meaning passed like glances in a shared shadow. Carefully, the gunfighter pieced together what little the boy allowed to surface. Tales of capture under cruel masters, the wrenching loss of family, whispered names of kin and ritual leaders now vanished like smoke on the wind. One evening, as the sun bled crimson into distant hills, a sharp sound fractured the fragile respite. the unmistakable crunch of hooves on hard earth. The gunfighter stiffened, his hand drifting toward the hilt of his revolver as a figure emerged from the dark. A woman, standing tall and tense, her eyes piercing through the flickering light like twin knives. Her presence was a jarring thunderclap against the cabin's cold walls. She spoke without preamble, voice as harsh and unyielding as desert stone. "You're walking a razor's edge, gunfighter. Holding on to that Apache boy, it's a fire that'll burn you alive." The gunfighter's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Her reputation preceded her. A mujer de mirada acerada, sharp-eyed, keeper of whispered truths from his shadowed past. She knew the kind of men he was, the roads he'd walked, and the ghosts that still trailed him. She stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. You don't just buy men, especially not those hunted by both white law and Apache blood. You're tempting bullets from every side. There's more at stake here than you reckon. Her words passed between them like the cold wind, dangerous, undeniable. Outside, unseen but palpable, the land held its breath. The nearby hills, draped in midnight, concealed silent watchers. Word had rippled swiftly through the Apache community. A brother taken, a kin in chains. The air thrummed with unrest and quiet fury. Messengers, swift and practiced, had begun to move through the scrublands, shadows passing silently beneath the pale light of stars, leaving trails of warning where only the keenest eyes noticed. Far from the gunfighter's cabin, beneath the skeletal branches of ancient trees, a council stirred with mounting tension. Elders marked the paths. Children pressed close to watch warriors prepare. The scent of sage and smoke threaded through these gatherings, a call to arms and loyalty. The betrayal cut deep. This was no mere slave retrieval. This was blood bound by honor and vengeance. Back at the cabin, the woman's sharp eyes flicked toward the distant hills. "You stirred a hornet's nest. Those messengers you'll see soon. They don't bring talk. They bring war." Gunfighter's hand trembled slightly as he shifted a worn leather strap. His mind raced. The lines of loyalty were drawn in sand, too thin to hold. Protecting the boy was no longer a solitary act. It was a summons to face consequences long buried. What he is, who he is, it weighs more than you know, the gunfighter said, voice low but edged with a new steel. And neither of us can walk away clean from this. The Apache, silent but alert, met the gunfighter's gaze, a complex language of respect, doubt, and something sharper, simmering beneath the surface. The tale of the captured boy spun wider threads in the chill night, weaving him into a destiny neither fully understood. As the woman's figure receded into the darkness, her warning lingered like a shadow cast by the unforgiving moon. Time was shrinking, and the balance they fought to hold was tipping. Later, beneath the canopy of somber stars, the gunfighter knelt to examine the soft earth near his door, finding the faintest impressions, hoofbeats and footprints, that spoke of recent passage, too light to have crossed so unnoticed. The messengers were close. The hunt was intensifying. He returned inside, eyes catching the quiet figure of the boy, watching through a narrow shutter slit. The Apache's face was a mask of fierce resolve, but something in his eyes, danced with a storm yet to break. A breath passed between them, heavier than words, and the gunfighter spoke softly. "They're coming, not just the law, but the ghosts of your people. Whatever storms that means, we face 'em head on." The boy's reply was a low whisper, carrying the weight of lost elders and fractured lands. "Then let them come. For the fire that burns inside me, it's hotter than any knife." Outside, the night shifted under the warning stars, the land itself seeming to hold its breath for the next move in their unfolding fate. From the thickets beyond the last ridge, shapes moved, silent, purposeful, eidolons of an ignited pursuit. The messengers Apache circled closer, their vigilance a living threat drawing the net taut. In the quiet pulse of the dark, the gunfighter steadied himself beside the boy, who was more than captive, a brother bound by peril, history, and a fragile hope. The hunt was no longer a distant threat. It was a shadow closing in fast, dark and unrelenting. The night had barely settled before sharp yells split the still air. A sudden storm bursting through the quiet, rousing the hollow hills with urgent danger. From the sheltered copse near the cabin, the gunfighter's eyes flickered beneath a lowered brow, catching the faint outline of figures breaking through the shadows. Soldiers from the fort, grim and determined, moved like ghosts with weapons drawn, their presence a threat heavier than the darkness itself. Behind them, blurred shapes, hired trackers and mercenaries, pushed forward silently, driven by whispering promises of reward cloaked in gunmetal cold. The gunfighter's breath hitched, muscles coiling beneath rough leather. His hand found the worn grip of his rifle, fingers tightening as years of hard-earned reflex took hold. Beside him, the Apache youth remained statuesque, eyes sharp slits that tracked each movement with a warrior's precision. The flicker of doubt now yielded to a flicker of respect, not the blind fury of rebellion, but the spark of uneasy alliance formed in fire. No words passed between them. The forest floor, littered with brittle leaves and cracked twigs, became a stage for the first grim dance of survival. The gunfighter's voice was a low gravel, barely more than the hiss of wind slipping between branches. "They'll be upon us quick. No use trying to run this time." His gaze locked onto the boy's face, searching for any sign of surrender, but found only steady defiance. The Apache shifted silently, muscles coiled like a panther preparing for the pounce. "They hunt with iron and fire," he said, voice laced with cold history. "But my blood remembers paths they cannot follow." With no more warning than the soft crack of a snapped branch, the ambush erupted, gunfire cracking through night's veil, sparks of lead carving through the darkness. The two moved as one. The gunfighter's rifle barked with ruthless precision, each shot a promise etched in smoke. The Apache darted like shadow, blades flashing in deadly arcs, silent and devastating. The world contracted into a heartbeat sown with pain, fear, and raw will. Amidst the chaos, a moment of fragile trust kindled, a shift in the balance of power, long held firm by chains and cold command. Where once the gunfighter bore the weight of ownership, now stood comrades bound by necessity. The boy's sharp eyes caught the fleeting flicker of concern etched across the gunfighter's face. mirrored by the man's implicit acceptance of a fight no one could win alone. As the last echo of gunfire died beneath the still night, the soldiers and hunters staggered back, wounded and bewildered. But the cost was etched with fresh scars. The gunfighter's shoulder burned with a searing bite, while the Apache clutched a bleeding hand, crimson. Marking more than flesh, breathing hard, the gunfighter lowered his gun, voice hoarse but measured. "You're stronger than I thought, not just a slave." His words hung in the heavy silence, a rare tribute born of survival, not sentiment. The Apache met the gaze without bending, pride deeper than pain. "I am the blood of my people, no man's possession." For a breath, they stood aligned. Foes turned reluctant allies, their fates entwined beneath the merciless stars. Yet, beneath the fragile calm, the night bore a darker secret. Later, near the flickering glow of their minimal campfire, the gunfighter's sharp eyes caught a quiet tension in the boy's gaze. The shadows seemed to lengthen, folding over the land like a shroud. The Apache finally spoke, voice almost a whisper. "There is something you must know. A secret I have carried heavier than chains." The gunfighter's expression hardened with wary curiosity. "Speak." The boy glanced skyward, as if drawing strength from the cold stars. "I am bound not just to this fight for freedom, but to a legacy older than these lands. A sacred trust between my people and the earth. My capture was no accident. It was a strike against that power." He paused, breathing, catching, as memories of lost tribes and blood-soaked betrayals clouded his eyes. "Among my people, I am heir to a sacred leadership, one erased by those who fear what it represents. That knowledge makes me dangerous, not just to men with guns, but to those who rule in shadows." The gunfighter's jaw clenched, the weight of this revelation settling like stone in his gut. The boy's truth was a powder keg beneath their fragile existence. Before the gunfighter could respond, a sudden movement shattered the fragile quiet. From beyond the trees, cloaked in darkness deeper than night itself, a figure emerged. Tall, imposing, face hidden beneath a heavy hood, eyes gleaming with cold intent. The air turned heavier, charged with menace. The hooded figure's gaze fixed unblinkingly on the camp. No words were spoken, but the intent was clear as a drawn gun. A reckoning had arrived. The gunfighter and Apache instinctively exchanged a glance fraught with unspoken understanding. Their tentative alliance would be tested sooner than either dared expect. The figure retreated silently into the shadows, but not before leaving behind a promise as chilling as the desert night. They were no longer merely hunted. They were watched by a shadow from the Apaches. Past, a force that threatened to unravel everything. And as the wind shifted, carrying the figure's silent warning, the gunfighter tightened his grip on the rifle, knowing the next move could be their last. The weight of the revelation settled like a stone in the dusty air. The Apache youth, no longer merely a captive or a prize, was the spiritual heir to a sacred leadership, long thought extinguished by brutal hands. The gunfighter's fingers curled instinctively toward the worn leather of his rifle, as the gravity of this truth pressed heavy on his chest. It was more than a secret. It was a spark hinged to powder, one that threatened to ignite violence from both the white world and the radical corners of the Apache community. Silence stretched between them, taut as a drawn bowstring. The boy's eyes, dark and fiery, flickered with unspoken memories, ancient rites crushed beneath bloodied boots, families torn apart by fear and greed. His voice finally broke the stillness, low and edged with a sorrow few could grasp. They took my birthright to weaken my people, but that chain does not break the spirit. The gunfighter studied him, the line between protector and purchaser becoming blurred in the harsh landscape of their shared fate. His own code of honor, carved in cold gunfire and endless solo miles, was now challenged by a truth that transcended law and survival. Together, they made a silent pact. They would seek out an old ally, someone grounded in the old ways, a protector who understood the weight of might yet save them both, or, if fate proved unkind, condemn them. The next day dawned bleached and brittle, under a sky hung in cracked blue. With careful movements, they left behind the fragile shelter of the cabin, shades of doubt and suspicion trailing close behind. The gunfighter's eyes scanned the horizon as they journeyed into the wild expanse of canyon and scrub. Each step measured against the grim knowledge that enemies loomed nearer than they had dared to imagine. Their destination was a remote bluff, a place whispered of in rare Apache circles, home to a man reputed as a fierce guardian of ancient wisdom, a figure both feared and respected. The gunfighter's grip tightened on his rifle as they crossed knotted roots and jagged stones, the weight of unseen eyes pressing. From the shadows, "The world you carry in your blood," the gunfighter murmured, voice low as the wind, "has enemies masked in plain sight." The boy's lips pressed tight, but his stride reflected steel forged by pain and resolve. "And allies, too," he answered softly. "If we find him, perhaps there is hope yet." Hours bled into aching twilight as they neared the bluff's crest. There, etched into the weathered rock, symbols carved by hands long vanished, whispered of battles waged beyond the grasp of ink and paper. Their footsteps stirred the dry grasses, but the land seemed to hold its breath. This was a place where history's heavy hand still lay palpable amid the dust. Suddenly, a subtle movement caught their eyes. From the shadows stepped a figure, a man whose bearing was both fierce and patient. Deep-set eyes gleamed beneath a weathered hat, skin creased by sun and storms alike. The stranger's gaze measured them with a sharpness born of knowing too many betrayals. "You come with a secret no man can carry lightly," he said, his voice low but steady, like a drumbeat that demands attention. "The blood you bear, boy, is a flame many want to smother." The gunfighter's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Watching carefully as the man's gaze shifted between them, the stranger nodded slowly. "I've tracked your path, seen the storms gathering. Those who hunt you are closer than the last breath of the desert wind." A chill crept along the gunfighter's spine. The truth of the warning was unmistakable. Their enemies had closed the noose far quicker than either had fathomed. "Why help us?" the gunfighter asked, voice gravelly yet wary. The allies' eyes darkened with a haunted past. Because this war is older than your hatred, Gunfighter. Because I owe a debt to the boy's people and to the land itself. Before the quiet promise could solidify, a faint rustle tore through the brush, a whisper of danger threading through the thinning light. The gunfighter's hand dipped to his rifle reflexively. The newcomer's eyes sharpened. They come, forces multiplied and ruthless, with stakes beyond life or death. The boy's stance hardened, the legacy of his ancestors pulsing beneath his skin. The gunfighter exchanged a look with him, a moment heavy with unspoken resolve. Their fragile alliance was about to be tested. Hidden in the twilight, they all became shadows hunting shadows. The line between hunter and hunted blurred beneath the encroaching dusk. The antediluvian struggle for survival and honor surged forward. But the true assault still lay ahead. And as the last dying light kissed the desert horizon, the harsh truth bit deep. The forces against them were far closer than they had ever imagined. The sun had barely kissed the horizon when the gunfighter and his young Apache charge pressed forward. Their steps hurried, yet cautious, across the unforgiving landscape. The weight of their journey settled heavy in the air, a relentless burden carried beneath the scorching sky and whispering wind. Ahead lay their destination, an old ally, a guardian rumored to hold ancient wisdom and fierce resolve. A flicker of hope in a world closing in around them. Each mile was a test, a gauntlet of both nature and human treachery. The arid terrain stretched endlessly, broken only by thorny brush and cragged rocks that clawed at their boots and scraped their skin. The sun beat down with an unforgiving glare, shadows retreating beneath its harsh light. Yet it was the unseen enemies, the ones lurking in the folds of dust and echoing silence, that threatened the most. The gunfighter's eyes were perpetually scanning, lips pressed thin as he guarded their path with a grim vigilance. The boy beside him moved with wary grace, muscles taut, his gaze flickering with a mix of purpose and pain long carried deep within. Between them hung an unspoken bond, fragile but growing, forged through shared brush with death and the raw edge of survival. Their fragile alliance solidified further when a sudden cry shattered the stillness, a piercing, urgent sound that cleaved through the midday calm. From the thicket ahead, rustling and frantic footsteps betrayed the presence of another. Without hesitation, they broke into a cautious run. The gunfighter's rifle held ready while the Apache's eyes narrowed, every sense sharpened to the immediate threat. They emerged onto a small clearing where a young Apache woman lay curled on the parched earth, her body bruised and trembling. Her clothes were torn and stained, her spirit seemingly broken but flickering stubbornly beneath her weariness. A cruel captivity had marked her. Chains scratched faintly around her wrists where healing wounds whispered stories of torment. The gunfighter knelt beside her, his face etched with concern beneath the ever-present stoicism. "You're safe now," he murmured, voice low, rough around the edges, like the land itself. "But you gotta move, quiet and fast." The woman lifted eyes that glittered with fierce determination hidden beneath pain, eyes that reflected a kindred spirit, battle-scarred and unbroken. I am Marrow. They caught me weeks ago, tortured, hunted. The Apache boy shifted beside them, an unyielding fire flaring in his gaze. We don't leave kin behind. The three moved as one, shadows slipping through the arid brush. Each step a careful dance woven from trust and necessity. The gunfighter adjusted the coat he draped over Marrow's slender shoulders, shielding more than her worn form. It was a silent vow that she now belonged to them. As the sun bled toward twilight, the unforgiving desert cooled, but the dangers only multiplied. The gunfighter's thoughts churned with every crunch of distant footsteps and every whisper of shifting wind through brittle leaves. They weren't alone. Enemies stalked them relentlessly, pawns to darker forces, threading a web of blood and power. Marrow shared fleeting details of her capture, of merciless men who thrived on control and violence, their cruelty as brutal as the harsh desert sun. Her story intertwined with the boys, revealing a network of hunters and bounty seekers bent on crushing any spark of Apache resistance. It was a world where loyalty was a blade turned sharply against the innocent. Despite the physical exhaustion pooling in their muscles, a new strength nodded within them. The woman's presence was a catalyst, a symbol of resilience that rekindled the fragile trust between the gunfighter and the boy. No longer mere protector and captive, they were comrades, united in an uneven war against a ruthless world set to erase them. Night fell like a velvet shroud, wrapping the trio in shadows that both concealed and oppressed. Around them, the desert whispered warnings carried on the cool, dry breeze, an unrelenting countdown ticking beneath the stars. The gunfighter paused, scanning the darkened ridges, breath steady, though his shoulder throbbed from old wounds reopened by the relentless trek. "We're close," he said, voice barely a rasp, but the danger's never been this near. The Apache boy's expression hardened, jaw clenched tight as ancient fury stirred beneath his skin. They rally at the outpost. Orders came down clear: kill the gunfighter, capture the Apache, no exceptions. The words hung in the bitter night, swallowed by the vast emptiness around them, but carrying weight like lead. Marrow's breath caught slightly, finger tightening. Around the worn strap of her satchel, her eyes shadowed pools of defiance. They want us broken, but they don't know what they're facing. The gunfighter's gaze swept to the boy, his reluctant charge, and now, irrevocably, his equal. Their long journey had morphed into something darker, more desperate. Trust had grown fierce, a brittle shield against the gathering storm. "You ready?" the gunfighter asked, voice laced with grim resolve. "Because the next road's no longer a run, it's a fight." A flicker of that old, indomitable fire flashed in the boy's eyes. Then we stand, together. Behind them, the desert stirred as distant hoofbeats thundered against the parched earth, an echo of violence closing the circle. The post sent its ravenous hunters forward, their orders ringing clear across the barren land. Eliminate the gunfighter and reclaim the Apache at any cost. The cliffhanger loomed, the quiet before a storm that would decide fates, ignite loyalties, and shatter the fragile peace they dared to find. The next movement on this savage board had already begun. The night rippled with tension as the murmurs of distant hoofbeats and whispered plans clawed at the stillness surrounding the gunfighter's makeshift refuge. The desert, usually a silent witness to countless tales whispered under the dying light, now seemed charged with a feverish urgency. From the east, the low rumble of a gathering storm echoed not through thunderclouds, but through steady movement. Troops of relentless lawmen, advancing with cold purpose. Their boots a harsh drumbeat against the cracked earth. Beside the gunfighter, the young Apache's gaze was fixed, a coiled thread of defiance and iron will, burning beneath eyes sharp with suspicion and readiness. They had known no peace since the day the gunfighter had bought him for $5, a price paid in shadows and promise, binding two unlikely souls to a then uncharted fate. Now, what had begun as a transaction had spiraled into a perilous dance with death and loyalty. The camp was sparse, scattered remnants of shelter and scattered firelight swallowed quickly by the advancing night. But the cold air bore whispered warnings of the coming storm. The gunfighter moved methodically, a silent shadow against the rough wooden walls of his cabin, his hands steady, even as his mind slid through memories best left untouched. That secret from his past, the choice he'd made years ago in blood and ash, loomed heavy, a ghost trailing his steps with bitter headaches, and whispered, "Regrets." This night would force that past into the cruel light. "Muscle and dust won't win this fight," the gunfighter murmured, voice low like wind slipping through dead grass. "We've got to be sharper than their bullets, smarter than their plans." The Apache youth nodded once, jaw clenched, hands twitching as if fingers itched for the cold kiss of steel. "Our ancestors walked shadows where men died in the sun. We'll do no less." Outside, the harsh clatter of horses grew louder. Soldiers from the fort, along with fierce warriors from radical Apache factions, converging swiftly like vultures circling prey. Their faces were grim with convictions buried deep, their cause tangled in vengeance, fear, and the dangers of fractured loyalties. It was no longer a mere chase. It had become a war of wills and ancient blood debts. The gunfighter crouched low, scanning the brush and broken terrain around the cabin. He urged his fragile coalition to move with care, to build defenses woven from the land itself and from secrets learned in fleeting moments of trust. Boxes became barricades, hidden pits were dug hastily, and silent signals exchanged with subtle nods and muted glances. Every motion was a testament to their evolving bond, him with every pulsing ache. The moral weight spilled quietly into his mind, threatening the focus this night demanded most. The Apache boy caught the flicker, reading the storm behind eyes that bore stories of blood and silence. "Your past is a shadow you carry, like I carry my chains," he said softly, voice roughened by desert winds. "But this fight needs what's in us both, not ghosts hidden behind steel." The gunfighter let out a brief, humorless grin before steel reclaimed his features. "Then we stand, because falling apart isn't an option anymore." Darkness deepened, and the first rattle of gun barrels echoed from the ridge, a sharp and sudden break of night's fragile silence. From that darkness, a trap snapped, a carefully laid ambush sprung by foes who knew the desperate costs of mercy. Chaos erupted. Flares of gunfire licked the night, shards of sound slicing through the still air. The gunfighter fired with ruthless economy. Each shot a calculated prayer for survival, while the Apache moved with feline grace, turning the shadows into extensions of his lethal will. Their movements entwined, brutal and rhythmic, as they fought not just for breath, but for the uncertain promise that had seated itself between them. Amid the volley and the fury, the ground beneath their feet became a savage battlefield. Friends fell, cries shattered the night, and the bitter taste of fear mingled with the acrid scent of spent gunpowder. When the dust briefly settled, the number of survivors was agonizingly few. The embers of their campfire did little to warm cold limbs soaked in sweat and blood. The gunfighter's shoulder bled, anew, sharp and relentless, while the Apache's hand bore a crimson smear, testament to wounds deeper than flesh. Yet, in the bleak aftermath, trust found itself hardening like forged steel. "You fought like a storm," the gunfighter said, voice hoarse, eyes never leaving the boy. "Not property, not just flesh to own." The Apache's stare returned fire, proud and unyielding. "I am not yours to buy. I am the blood of my people, free in spirit despite these chains." The fragile calm shattered with the soft but ominous sounds of footsteps, a presence darker than any foe. From the shadowed edge stepped a figure, draped in a cloak as black as a moonless night, face lost beneath a heavy hood. Eyes glowed with cold intent, silent and watchful as a vulture waiting for carrion. No words were spoken, but the message was clear. The past had caught up with them. This shadow from the Apache's history, veiled in power and vengeance, had returned to tip the scales. The gunfighter's hand tightened on his rifle, heart pounding in rhythms both ancient and fierce. The boy met his gaze, the fire of shared defiance swelling between them. "We are watched," the Apache whispered, voice tight with warning. "And this is only the beginning." Then, suddenly, from the darkest corner of the night, a treacherous ambush struck, a brutal, swift strike with savage precision. Shouts erupted as the group was caught off guard. Chaos ripped through their fragile defenses. Bullets tore through the quiet like thunderclaps. Men fell, resistance shattered. The bitter night drank deeply of blood and despair. When the gunshots ceased, only a handful remained, battered, breathless, struggling against the crushing weight of loss. The fate of the gunfighter, the Apache, and their dwindling band now dangled on a knife's edge, sealed by that bitter betrayal in the heart of darkness. The moon, indifferent as ever, cast its pale light over the ruined camp, silent witness to a war that would soon decide their destinies. Darkness clung thickly around the campsite, a suffocating shroud over the tired breaths of those left standing. The heavy silence was sharper than any gunshot, broken only by the restless shifting of bodies. The gunfighter sat hunched beside the fading fire, sweat and dust painting streaks across his weathered face. His shoulder throbbed fiercely, a reminder of the price paid in that last brutal skirmish. Yet his eyes held a harder edge now, flickering, with the weight of battles still to come. Beside him, the young Apache kept his gaze lowered, but not subdued. There was a fire beneath his calm, a simmering defiance that neither scars nor chains could extinguish. This was no longer simply a boy forced into captivity. He was a spirit locked in fierce struggle with ghosts old as the land itself. The camp had fractured beneath the assault, and in the brittle quiet that followed, suspicion clawed through the remaining few. Whispers curled like smoke, voices laced with fear and doubt. Some cast wary looks at the gunfighter, their eyes asking silent questions about leadership and trust. Others glared at the Apache, suspicion sharpening into accusation. Was he a curse brought unwittingly into their fragile fold? A danger waiting to resurface? From the shadows, a hardened voice snapped, broke the uneasy pause. "We can't trust those who brought this fire down on us," spat one grizzled survivor. "Buying a slave for $5? Reckon it's a curse wrapped in coin." The gunfighter's jaw tightened, muscles bunching in controlled fury. The weight of their judgment was a blade, but he held firm, his voice a low growl cutting through the tension. "You want to survive? You fall in line. This ain't about trust. It's about necessity." The Apache's eyes flicked up at the outburst, sharp and unwavering. "I am no man's curse," he said quietly, voice calm but laced with steel. "I bear the blood of my people, broken but unyielding." Murmurs rippled. The camp was a tinderbox, ready to ignite with every whispered doubt and accusation. Yet beneath, the fractures of fear, bonds had begun to forge, a fragile alliance, tempered in fire and blood. But it was the wounds within that threatened deepest, the unseen fractures of loyalty and the poisonous seeds of betrayal. The gunfighter felt it stirring among them, a hidden hand, eager to pry apart their tenuous unity. Eyes that once nodded in unspoken allegiance now darted with suspicion. Allies whispered behind backs, voices dipped low, with words sharp as knives. The pulse of the camp quickened with a venomous intensity. The heavy truth surfaced. There were enemies within, shadows that mistrusted the gunfighter's leadership and resented the Apache's very presence. The suggestion of a custody misstep was no mere grievance. It was a challenge, a declaration that the fragile order could not hold. In the midst of this turmoil, the Apache stood tall, his figure etched sharp against the flickering firelight. With a resolve born of ancient bloodlines and centuries of struggle, he declared a reckoning, his voice cutting through the swell of doubt. "I will face the past that haunts me, not as a captive, but as the heir my people need, to fight shadows both without and within." The gunfighter's gaze hardened, respect flickering through the cool steel in his eyes. "Then face it you shall," he murmured, "but not alone." Together, they moved toward the edge of the camp where the world beyond waited cold and relentless. There, from the veil of night, stepped the figure cloaked in black, the enigmatic shadow that had haunted the Apache's past, like a gathering storm. The hooded presence was a ghost from a darker time, its eyes gleaming with a mixture of menace and something far deeper, power laced with old grudges. Without a word, the two men regarded each other in silent challenge. The Apache's fingers flexed tightly around a worn knife, the air thick with the promise of confrontation beyond mere words. This was no ordinary duel. It was a battle for legacy, honor, and the very future of their intertwined fates. The moment stretched taut, like a bow drawn to its breaking point. Then, with a subtle nod, the Apache stepped forward, meeting his enigmatic foe with a warrior's courage tempered by years of pain. The duel was silent but fierce, each movement a language of survival and defiance. Sparks flew not just from blades, but from the clashing histories they carried. The gunfighter waited near the edge, muscles coiled, but purpose clear. His own burdens, the law, the moral cost of his actions, sat heavy on his shoulders. Yet in this moment, the fight belonged to the Apache. Minutes passed that felt like hours, each strike and parry laced with meaning beyond the physical. Then, unexpectedly, the shadow lowered its weapon, eyes meeting the boys with a grudging acknowledgement. The hooded figure's voice, low and barely above a whisper, broke the silence. So it shall be, but the game changes. No man walks the border unchanged. The Apache nodded slowly, the corner of his mouth twitching with a brief, weary smile. Then let us rewrite the rules. As the figure disappeared back into the night, swallowed once more by the darkness that birthed it, the camp seemed to exhale. But this was no end, it was a turning point. The gunfighter and the Apache returned, side by side, their burden shared, and the stakes higher than ever before. Around them, the camp listened, hearts pounding with the realization. The duel had ended not in death, but in a fragile accord that would shift the battlefield forever. And as the first pale light of dawn stretched across the horizon, painting the world in shades of uncertain hope, the gunfighter knew one truth above all. The game had changed. The next move, unpredictable and dangerous, would decide the fate of both men and the fragile legacy they were bound to protect. The desert held its breath beneath the cold moonlight as the gunfighter and the Apache crouched in the shadowed hollow, their eyes scanning the distant lines where enemy forces gathered like vultures circling wounded prey. The whispers of betrayal had proven true. There was a traitor among the remnants of their ragged band, a poison spreading just as dangerously as the rifles aimed to finish them off. As silence deepened, the Apache's keen gaze caught the subtle movement of a figure slipping closer, cloaked in secrecy and treachery. The revelation hit like a thunderclap. Their fragile trust had been shattered by one who claimed loyalty. Heart pounding, the gunfighter's hand hovered near his pistol, muscles coiled for the fight that now seemed all but inevitable. "We're surrounded by more than just enemies in the dust," he murmured, voice gravelly but steady. "The true battle lies within." The Apache nodded, the fire in his eyes unwavering, despite the chilling sting of betrayal. "Then all that's left is to face it." Together, they formulated a desperate plan. To break the siege, they would turn the hunters into the hunted. Their aim was not just survival, but striking at the heart of the system that traded men like chattel, tearing families apart with cold commerce and cruel indifference. Under the cloak of darkness, they slipped through narrow passes no enemy would dare tread, weaving through jagged canyons and hidden trails whispered down from forgotten elders. Every step was fraught with danger. The howling wind, carrying the distant echo of pounding hooves and the faint rattle of gunmetal. It was not only a battle of bullets and brawn, but a war of reputation and shifting allegiances. The gunfighter, once a solitary myth of cold justice, now found himself confronting the brutal politics of a world steeped in blood and prejudice. His every choice peeled back the layers of a system that justified cruelty through law and fear. As dawn streaked pale pink across the horizon, they reached the edge of the enemy's encampment, a bastion fortified by hardened men and dangerous loyalties. The Apache spoke softly, recounting an ancient tale, a call to justice that had echoed across generations, a line drawn in the red earth between oppression and freedom. With a quiet nod, the gunfighter tightened his grip on his rifle. "It ends today," he said, voice low but unwavering. "Not just for you, but for all who've suffered under these chains." The battle ignited with brutal intensity. Bullets tore through the early light like morning cries. The gunfighter moved with precision, born of years steeped in conflict. Each shot a defiant promise. Beside him, the Apache was a whirlwind of fierce grace, his blade flashing with the weight of sacred heritage, cutting through the tide of enemies that threatened their fragile hope. Amidst smoke and chaos, the shadowed figure of the traitor revealed itself, eyes gleaming with greed and desperation. The gunfighter's voice rang out, a harsh proclamation slicing through the din. "Your greed brought this war to our doorstep. Your betrayal ends here." In a swift, harrowing confrontation, the traitor fell, exposed and broken beneath the weight of justice long overdue. The betrayal that threatened to unravel them had been crushed, but not without cost. As the enemy ranks faltered, a grim silhouette stepped forward, the hooded figure from the Apache's past, the ghostly power that had stalked them with silent menace. His eyes burned with cold fury, but beneath the harsh gaze, a flicker of something else lurked. Respect, perhaps, or a recognition of unyielding spirit. "You fought well," the figure intoned, voice low and layered with ancient grudges. "But the border is a land of shadows, and none walk untouched." The Apache met the gaze steadily, voice strong and clear, despite the scars etched on his soul. "Then may this land remember those who dared to rise." A tense stillness hung between them before the figure lowered his hood in a solemn gesture, an unspoken accord forged in the crucible of conflict. The war was far from over, but a new chapter had begun, one written in alliance, honor, and hope. With the dawn fully risen, the gunfighter and Apache stood side by side amid the scattered bodies and settling dust, their breath heavy but spirits unbroken. The air was thick with the bitter taste of loss, but beneath it lay the hard-won seeds of freedom. The gunfighter spoke quietly, voice edged with newfound resolve. "I bought you for $5, but what we've earned together is worth more than any sum. Freedom, respect, a chance to rewrite what the world thought was unchangeable." The Apache returned the gaze, fierce and proud. "Chains may mark the flesh, but never the spirit. Together, we are no longer possessions. We are brothers. Our fight is for those who cannot fight for themselves." Around them, scattered survivors began to stir, the embers of fear slowly giving way to cautious hope. The enemy's grip had been shattered, the corrupt system that commodified human lives shaken by a reckoning born of defiance and courage. Far off, the first light touched the ancient mesa, painting it in hues of gold and rose. The desert wind carried a whisper of endings and beginnings entwined, of paths forged anew on bloodied but unbroken ground. As they mounted their horses, ready to face whatever future awaited beyond the horizon, a quiet promise echoed between them, unspoken but fiercely felt. The decision made for $5 had sparked a fire that could not be extinguished. It had changed their fate, and the fate of countless generations yet unborn. Their journey was far from over, but at last they rode free, not just as hunter and hunted, but as brothers bound by honor, courage, and the unyielding hope that from the ashes of the past, a new dawn would rise.